Dallas, I don't feel too well.
Welcome to episode 9. This will be the first part of a two-parter covering Josephine Armistead's The Silicon Ideology. Abstract 1. Out of the technological centers of the world has come a new strange variant of fascism, namely neo-reaction or NRX. I shall here provide a critique of this ideology and an attempt at understanding of its origins, its tactics, and how it may be defeated. The author explains to us a very important distinction. Instead of focusing on traditional fascism and its shockwave effects in the modern world, we're instead going to focus on branches of fascism that are more fashionable and applicable to our technology and progress-obsessed world. Neo-reaction encompasses futurism, the Silicon Valley libertarian technocracy, and of course, transhumanism. Introduction 2. When one learns I am studying a new emergence of fascism in Europe and North America, one might be tempted to believe I am referring to the larger trend of the rise of right-wing populist parties and candidacies that may be considered fascist, such as the candidacy of Donald Trump and the rise of the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, Le Pen's Front National, FN, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, and Golden Dawn, among others. However, in this essay, I discuss a more narrow group, specifically an ideology that has emerged in the past decade or so inside the capitals of the tech world and which is growing at an alarming rate, often, but not always, affiliated with those parties and candidacies I have mentioned above, neo-reactionaries and what is known as the alt-right. More of a distinction is made by the writer to promptly parse terms and meanings. In this day and age, fascism has become synonymous with right-wing populism, like Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban in Hungary, UKIP, and I would also argue for Lega Nord in Italy and Modi's current government in India. Right-wing populism, with its tendency towards nationalism, fierce militarism, xenophobia towards migrants, etc., is actually just the background information for this work, which we will spend the majority of the first part of this two-parter trying to contextualize. Most Silicon Valley tech bros have in mind a sort of alt-right undercurrent running through their work when they see technological aggression and capital accumulation behind corporatocracies as being ideal to further both power centralization and a group of well-educated, future-minded, able-bodied, efficient technocrats. Three, I do not take it for granted that this odd ideology will not grow. Indeed, it is already growing. I do not believe we should underestimate our enemies, and most people severely underrate the influence of the alt-right, which is, especially in Silicon Valley, already courting influential figures such as Peter Thiel of PayPal, many of whom belong to a particular ideological predecessor of neo-reactionary thought, namely, the techno-utopian right libertarianism pervasive in the tech industry. There's this great phenomenon that overcomes every slightly progressive movement, underestimating the opposition and then getting thrown under the tidal wave. We keep repeating, "It can't happen here," while making fun of the Viking guy LARPing at the Capitol, but then people start dying and we say, well, guess they're not just angry kooks after all. What we as people opposing fascism in all forms need to take seriously, even if we sound alarmist, is the risk neo-reactionary ideologies pose to our reactionary technological sector, our attempts at innovation, and the people we court along the way. Remember Omid Yar, the guy who founded eBay and created The Intercept and First Look Media? He fits into this category perfectly. I can guarantee there are people out there that want him and his techno-ubermenches to form an oligarchy of cool, snappy, suave businessmen and take this country into the stratosphere of progress and profits at all costs. Remember when people said, "Trump's a businessman. I trust him to handle America's business." Yeah, look where that got us. On the various theoretical accounts of fascism and its origins. Walter Benjamin. 4. According to Benjamin, though this notion is not exclusive to him, fascism blocks and diverts the energies that otherwise would be useful to form a revolution against capitalism. It fills the void provided by an unsuccessful or non-existent revolution and must be understood from this perspective. To put it succinctly with a Benjamin quote, "Behind every fascism, there lies a failed revolution," end quote. It offers the emotional release of a revolution while effecting no material change, and the production of this catharsis is easily seen in the propaganda of the era. If fascism implies the aestheticization of politics, Benjamin reasons, it must be related to the traditional Marxist notion of commodity fetishism. Indeed, fascism presents, according to Benjamin, the promise of revolution, a strong, self-reliant, and harmonious state as a commodity. In order to maintain the fascist movement and control over the intense emotional release it provides while refusing to challenge capitalism, fascism relies on war, which also creates enough expenditure to temporarily resolve crises of overproduction, like the Great Depression. This is a hard one even for me to parse, but I'm sure smarter people than me who are well versed in critical theory will be able to explain this with greater clarity. From what I gather, fascism makes the energies behind a revolution impotent to the point where there is no longer any incentive to actually overthrow or alter the capitalist superstructure in any meaningful way. When a revolution fails, fascism fills a void and allows for those very same feelings of incompetence and resentment to channel themselves into an impetus. When bourgeois democracy collapses and we fail to get the machinations to change, fascism says, "Hey, instead of trying to uproot the problem again, try this," and then provides us with a product that should be a superior model: functional, orderly, rigid, no nonsense, and commanding. But in reality, it's meet the new boss, same, though more repressive, as the old boss. Under fascism, instead of us making commodities too fetishized, our entire social framework is a commodity that works for us. There is an outright scattering of energy, and that's where the perpetual enemy comes from, the East Asia versus Eurasia conflict. Five. Benjamin connects the aestheticization of war with an artistic political movement in Italy which preceded fascism and whose proponents became fascists: Futurism. Futurists celebrated technology, speed, and aggression, and technology is an aspect of war that is easily aestheticized. While human suffering is usually omitted in the aestheticization of war, in a fascist mode, destruction too must be aestheticized, not merely edited out. Benjamin, in Theories of German Fascism, connects this to Ernst Junger's War for War's Sake. Junger mysticizes war as a magical force which the state must be worthy of. This, Benjamin claims, derives easily from Junger's experience as an officer, not a mere grunt. And indeed, the Nazis saw their first support base from disgruntled World War I officers such as Hitler himself and the Freikorps. Futurism is insanely technocratic, autocratic, and sanitized. We are, in essence, the machines we tried to create. We live like automatons, harder, better, faster, stronger. Our existence is a Ford assembly line. Fascism and its adjacent political ideologies fetishize the cult of death. That death gives us wings and makes us immortal and great, if only through our aesthetic and sacrifice. Deleuze and Guattari. 6. They argue that fascism is created through libidinal and psychological repression through the mechanisms of the nuclear family, which represses and distorts the desires of the child, making them a docile subject that is easily controlled and will submit. The Oedipus complex is seen as arising from the familial suppression and distortion of desires. Deleuze and Guattari say, quote, "It is in one and the same movement that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial drives." End quote. Deleuze and Guattari can be here criticized for using the term fascism to refer to this, because it seems to divorce fascism from its historical context and from a larger social context. While this may indeed be an integral part of fascism, I don't think we can reduce fascism to this. Deleuze and Guattari have anticipated this, and so this repression and distortion of desire on a small scale has been termed microfascism, as opposed to macrofascism. This claim is a little whack, but we can get some good stuff out of it. Deleuze and Guattari are essentially trying to say that people are, like with Benjamin's analysis, rendered impotent, distorted, and suppressed by traditional structures like the nuclear family. Ergo, because they are subsumed into this lifestyle of a comfortable middle-class living and family structure, probably if they are a man, battling under the heel of an authoritarian father, which fascism's archetype favors, and are weakened and repressed by this. A person is constantly having their desires repressed and distorted, even in the social production realm of work. As the author says, equating fascism with its suppression is a little sus, given the historical context, but we'll take what we can get from this theory and apply it to a part of fascism, not the whole. A unified theory. 7. I would like to first make the proposition that fascism is distinguished from other forms of bourgeois rule both by the degree of action of its terroristic repressive apparati and, like Benjamin notes, the aestheticization of war in bourgeois democracy, which requires the erasure of human suffering. But under fascism, the aestheticization of war relies upon scenes of destruction. Because fascism relies on war to channel the emotions used to aestheticize politics, it relies on nationalism, justifying war, and class collaboration. What in China was a line of two unite in one, as opposed to one divide in two, justifying the lack of change in property relations. Nationalism relies on essentialism, the idea of an eternal, unchangeable, inherent nature preceding human existence, which is a form of idealism. A fascism of the 21st century, which, though very different in ways from the 20th century fascism, which finds its roots in neoliberalism, not Victorian liberalism, is clearly derived and indebted to it. As I made reference to in an earlier note, fascism loves to indulge in the cult of death and the heroic sacrifice. Think of Japan's kamikaze pilots. Imperial Japan was as fascist as they come, and I can't think of a better example. heralding death as the ultimate show of masculinity, a, quote, real man dies for his country, end quote, is the fascist extension of worshipping the dead more than the living, turning glory into a competition of mystic nationalism. Why do our heroes have special places and myths that they go to when they die? Why don't they die and go to the same places as us? It's because the aestheticization of victory ensures that we, the average, must venerate the extraordinary with special perks because they died for the motherland or fatherland, some intangible thing that just served to generate spectacle. War channels that fervor, channels the feelings of nationalism that we always must remain essential and bound to the very earth we stand on, as if it's not all nebulous BS anyway. That final line of text for this note makes a great distinction. Though fascists tend to revile the Enlightenment philosophies, there is a certain respect for liberalism in that it allows men to be morally superior and rational if they have access to reasonable discourse. I would say there is more of a focus on the immaterial and being right than the material, which we see in neo-fascist futurists, who want money, progress, automation, speed, efficiency, and bold-faced aggression. I think we've become much more libidinal. This next highlight will be read for example. These are the main differences, according to the author Josephine Armistead, between bourgeois democracy and fascism, especially fascism of the modern-day neo-reaction. Number 1. Fascism is one of two forms of bourgeois rule, the other being bourgeois democracy. There are no primary differences, but there are secondary differences. 2. Fascism regards and emerges in the shadows of a failed revolution. That is, at times when bourgeois rule is weak, but a revolution has either failed, been betrayed by centrist, social democratic forces, or similarly, been forestalled or delayed. In the latter case, the turn to fascism is an attempt to block a revolutionary movement from forming or gaining success. 3. Fascism transforms politics and its promise of revolutionary change into a commodity. It thusly aestheticizes politics, giving the masses the intensity of emotion associated with revolutionary change, but maintaining an even stronger devotion to maintaining bourgeois rule and property relations. 4. In order to maintain these emotions, fascism constructs a Weltanschauung that opportunistically ransacks various philosophies of useful concepts and creates an idealistic philosophy that contains nationalism and class collaboration. 5. This Weltanschauung provides the ideological support for war, which is the chief way in which fascism may continually maintain intense emotional response and control them without changing property relations. 6. War, too, is aestheticized, but destruction and suffering are not merely edited out, as in bourgeois democracy, but glorified. In the course of the aestheticization of war, the technology of war is frequently aestheticized as well. Both bourgeois democracy and fascism rely on terrorism, but fascism is more terroristic than bourgeois democracy. The freedoms the proletariat, however temporarily, are allowed to exert are larger in bourgeois democracy. 8. Fascism and bourgeois democracy are theoretical extremes or archetypes. All bourgeois regimes have elements of both types. The seeds of fascism are in bourgeois democracy. Nevertheless, the two can be distinguished. 9. Bourgeois democracy is unstable, and as the bourgeois regime faces a crisis or its overthrow, the bourgeois will turn to fascism in order to block the emergence of a successful revolutionary movement. And finally, 10. Fascism relies on the exploitation of microfascisms, the repression and distortion of desiring production by units and institutions such as the nuclear family among the populace to create docile subjects that desire their own repression. A history of 20th century fascism. The ideological influences upon fascism. 9. We see the emphasis on the state and absolutism in Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Hegel. The tradition of essentialist German nationalism began with Johann Gottfried Herder and was quickly used for anti-Semitic ends. Fascism rejects the French Revolution and its legacy, though learns from its methods. As the 19th century progressed, liberal ideology, then as now, found inspiration in biology, and thus created a capitalist interpretation of biology. Social Darwinism, born from Spencer's reading of Malthus and Darwin, though it is more ode to Lamarck originally, it only took a jump from there to eugenics, a liberal project formulated by Sir Francis Galton, FRS, and supported by Alexander Graham Bell, Winston Churchill, Theodore Roosevelt, John Maynard Keynes, Francis Crick, James Watson, and Margaret Sanger. Indeed, implemented first in America through compulsory sterilization, which has not truly ended. And this too cooperated well with Gobineau's racialism, creating the liberal ideology of scientific racism, justifying immigration restriction and anti-miscegenation laws among others, and its nightmare scenario, degeneration theory, as promoted by Max Nordau in his 1892 work, Degeneration. It is important to emphasize that all of this was well accepted within Anglo-American liberalism. Indeed, the first eugenics program was created in California. This is further background that contextualizes how we got here today. Fascism is a fairly new ideology as a whole, but the building blocks, the composites, that make up the whole are as old as the hills. Some of these, such as evolution, were twisted for social evils by social Darwinists and made to look like viable alternatives to altruism and social welfare. It's no secret that fascism jives with people who see the world as Hobbes did, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So much of what fascism espouses, race realism, phrenology, eugenics, the cult of death, nationalism, the never-ending war, it's all a self-fulfilling prophecy to say, we really are all animals and power is king, so why don't I join the winners now and claw my way out of indignity from amongst these inferior animals? Reality is a zero-sum game to fascists. There are only winners and losers, us versus them, the good and the bad. Even if they are not spiritual, fascists are divided pretty evenly between religious folks and atheists, there is still this moral and value judgment that some people are just better, more divine, more right, more just, etc. Their worldview is based on superlatives. Liberalism is rejected because it presumes that people have an inherent vulnerability. The vulnerability to be fair, organized, democratic, and strive for equality in discourse and material conditions, while also being high-minded and idealistic. Fascists see neoliberals of all stripes as being weak, ivory towers who need to cloak all of their policies in respectability and honor. Fascists do not need justification. (10) Wagner's aesthetics were the next ingredient in the fascist soup, as was the essentialist psychology of Gustave Le Bon, who argued that white men were essentially superior to women and people of color. This, too, has resurfaced in the field of evolutionary psychology in the book The Bell Curve. Nietzsche's rhetoric inspired the fascists with an attack on collectivism, the concept of the Übermensch, and the recuperation of Schopenhauer's will to live as the will to power. Henri Bergson's Élan Vital, centering around free choice, allowed a rejection of materialism. Gaetano Mosca's The Ruling Class 1896, claimed that in all societies, an organized minority will rule a disorganized majority, and that the structure of the military is a useful guide to structure society, especially due to its officer class, presenting the structure of the military as a model for civil society. Democracy would inevitably lead to bureaucratization, hierarchy, and oligarchy. This, too, became useful for fascists. Maurice Barré's ethnic nationalism was combined with an appeal to patriotism, militarism, charismatic leadership, and a hero myth. What we see here is an idealistic liberal idea of science and progress justifying a deeply reactionary social structure, which itself learns tactics from its leftist enemies. Some more ingredients in the fascist nightmare milkshake. It's very surprising that fascists seem to enjoy rallying against collectivists when they are quite literally collectivists themselves. Fascists like to seem better than their peers by looking more presentable. Suits, hyper-feminine outfits, white picket fence, fascists fetishize the cult of the family too. Certain hairstyles, old-world classical aesthetics, military outfits, etc. Throw in no social mobility, meritocracies don't exist unless it's other people being better than you, in which case it's because the Jewish bankers did it. And hierarchy is king. Institutionalized means of discrimination are essential because, whilst fascists need to rail against academia and intelligentsia, they also need to have those spaces ripe for the picking. The enemy is both strong and weak, controlling big institutions and being utterly incompetent. I want to emphasize the last sentence. I don't think most people who want technological progress are fascists. But again, it's co-opting the aesthetic of a liberal-minded march towards progress and letting it serve as the breeding ground for those who insist upon letting the machines be used for socially reactionary purposes. The interwar period. 11. In Italy, as Trotsky has related above, whatever gains workers had made through agitation were erased by the reformists, who thought that a more moderate, peaceful approach was necessary in order to maintain public opinion. Soon, the workers were in retreat and the fascists took over. In Germany, the Spartacus uprising was crushed by the Social Democrats, who enlisted the help of the reactionary Freikorps paramilitaries that would later form the basis of the SA and SS. In both cases, the centrist, moderate, reformist, even liberal elements of the left, Social Democrats, got cold feet and betrayed and violently suppressed a revolutionary movement before its prime, in favor of a business-as-usual reformist negotiation with finance capital. The conceding of the left in its engagement in politics as usual allowed fascism to portray itself as the ideology of systemic change, aestheticizing radical politics. I'm not going to dunk on Socidems too hard because the scenario isn't their fault. It's what scared people do regardless of ideology. Getting cold feet at the precipice is unfortunate, life-ending even. Fascists will march right in with their jackboots and claim that the forces that be really are impotent and that the only way forward is to seize power by stratifying social order even further, giving some little oligarchy supreme power, and letting the stone roll downhill. It's unfortunate. At a base level, I know Socidems, liberals, and whatnot want to maintain the they go low, we go high rhetoric, but at the end of the day, the pragmatism of doing so becomes negligible when you realize that we're all rolling in the mud and some people might die for respectability politics' sake. The crux is this: some people do not realize that finance capital will not save them and cannot be fixed. We have been conditioned to expect that others upstairs are fixing it for us and that we have no means of really doing anything because it's all too big to fail or too big to change. Our avenues are blocked, so we just carry on. But that's what fascists are counting on, that we stay in the hamster ball instead of leaving it. Reform is good up until a point. Some things simply need to be fixed from the ground up. and cannot be reformed. Public opinion and optics are things apolitical people care about more than anything, but you'd be hard-pressed to be popular with those who would rather watch TV than learn about the Black Panthers. It cannot be business as usual. Neo-reaction and its historical and discursive origins. Neo-reaction is a 12th century variant of fascism, a new ideology that values stability, order, efficiency, and good governance above all, or claims to. The actual beliefs, paraphrased, are a rejection of equality, a commitment to right-wing politics, a commitment to hierarchy, a commitment to traditional sex roles, a rejection of libertarianism, and a rejection of democracy. A short but sweet description. In a world where George W. Bush tells us to shop after 9/11 to self-soothe, then there will always be a world in which progress, innovation, ingenuity, and human-machine cooperation and creation are twisted into a means of power-seeking. Stability, order, efficiency, and good governance are not bad on their own or even in combination. Your boss or manager at work probably wants these things too. But the problem lies in how they tie into the characteristics of fascism: rejection of equality, rejection of non-traditional gender expression, rigid social structure, rejection of democracy, etc. This next highlight will be read, for example, for some more neo-reactionary values. Number 1. Transhumanism and faith in the power of technology as a means towards other ends. 2. An authoritarian form of government. In more moderate or reasonable forms, this takes the form of running the country in a joint stock corporation. This, for example, is Moldbug's position, which is well within the norm of neoliberal thought. This, however, blends into calling for monarchy and aristocracy in more extreme variants, if we classify them as moderate and extreme, with the ruler usually in either case being either a tech CEO, with several proposals being floated to make Eric Schmidt or Elon Musk or Peter Thiel CEO of America, or a super-intelligent machinic mind. The neo-reactionaries hope to be the aristocrats, or, sometimes, monarchs of their own in a patchwork of principalities somewhat reminiscent of the Holy Roman Empire. 3. The belief in a cathedral, similar to the role ideology plays in leftist theory, but one that pushes progressive ends: feminism, multiculturalism, democracy, equality, as a hostility towards this cathedral. 4. White, or less frequently, East Asian, or still less frequently, South Asian, nationalism, accompanied by scientific racism, eugenics, social Darwinism, degeneration theory, biological determinism, and a belief that ethnic uniformity increases social capital, very frequently accompanied with anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitic canards of the early 20th century, almost always accompanied with Islamophobia. 5. Faith in the Austrian School of Economics, or, less frequently, its more respectable, less obviously astrological cousin, the Chicago School. 6. Extreme misogyny based in evolutionary psychology, the active promotion of rape, stemming from this belief in traditional gender roles, extreme homophobia, and transphobia. 7. Cultural touchstones in war-based video games and tabletop games, such as the Imperium in Warhammer 40k, along with The Matrix, a movie, ironically, written and directed by two trans women partially about gender theory. One, in any case, that the NRXers have unfortunately clinged on to in bad readings, And finally, 8. Among the last academic, an obsession with cuckoldry and the use of mass harassment tactics, death threats, rape threats, DDoS, doxing, swatting, misinformation campaigns, etc., to silence enemies. 14. There are 2 poles within neo-reaction, the academic pole and the alt-right pole. The 2 poles meet on Reddit, Twitter, and Tumblr, among other sites. In addition, neo-reactionary ideas are quite common in Silicon Valley, though often without explicit allegiance to its theories, as can be seen in the statements of Peter Thiel and Balaji Srinivasan, among others. It's surprising to see people like Peter Thiel ascribe to neo-reactionary ideology. Folks like him probably have no idea they're even acting as the propagators of something truly insidious. Anyway, we can see that social media has served as an intersection for fascists to congregate, whether they be institutionalized or just informal ideologues. The alt-right as a term was actually coined by Richard Spencer, aka the man who got punched and is now less relevant than ever. Sites like 8kun are breeding grounds for hatred to spread, but also, we have seen incidences of stochastic terrorism where we can trace the perpetrator to involvement on social media sites. Though many sites have forced Nazis off their platforms, Nazis congregate around different sites that are less mainstream and specifically catered to their taste. What is transhumanism? And finally, for this video, 15. Transhumanism I define to be the collection of movements aimed at improving and enhancing humanity through technological means. Almost immediately, we see a precursor and one which influenced the previous reactionary ideology of 20th century fascism, eugenics. But let us not tar all humanism with eugenics, though it must carry its historical burden. Organized groups of transhumanists began to gather at UCLA in the early 1980s, many of whom would subscribe to the Third Way of the 1990s, not to be confused with third positionism, another word for fascism. As seen in the disputes in 2006 at the World Transhumanist Association, and from the ideologies of the extropians, the libertarians largely did not see the necessity of universalism for a transhumanist project. They thus were comfortable with a class system being strengthened by transhumanism, indeed reinforced it through the idea of meritocracy. They too were more comfortable with the eugenics programs of old, now largely framed, as then, through ableism, preventing liabilities, mostly disabled and neurodivergent people, though the more homophobic and transphobic elements are looking for biological basis for gayness and transness to include them here, and racist of course, including people of color, as opposed to assets from being born. This of course is a reflection of the fact that both the eugenics of old and the right transhumanism, if we can call it that, as opposed to left transhumanism, which seems largely limited to left accelerationists, have applied liberal bourgeois ideology, one might point in particular to utilitarianism. And that concludes this part. This is part 1 of 2 in episode 10 of Dictate, Dissect, and Discuss. We will finish the Silicon ideology. I look forward to seeing you next time. Take it easy. 2, 7, 5, 3, 8.